Chapter 16. George, what are you doing down here? She cried. It took him a while to catch his breath. He was wearing blue sweatpants and a gray sleeveless t-shirt. The front of the t-shirt was stained with sweat. I've been running, he said, finally brushing back his red-black hair with his hand. I run every morning. I was near the path. I heard your conversation with Hetty. I guess you could call it a conversation, Renee said bitterly. She had no right to talk to you that way, George said heatedly. Go tell her. Renee turned away from him and headed for the dock. Why did he haunt her? She asked herself. Why couldn't he leave her alone? She had hoped to get away from the camp without having to see him again, without having to say goodbye. But there he was, loping along beside her, his dark eyes looking for something in hers, something they weren't about to find. I just wanted to walk, be by myself, she said, not wanting to hurt his feelings, but hoping he'd take the hint just the same. Come with me, he said softly. He took her hand. His hand was hot and wet. I want to show you something beautiful. In the boathouse. It might cheer you up. She pulled back. I don't really need to be cheered up. He tightened his grip. Come on anyway, he said, laughing. You'll like this. Back said not to go into the boathouse, she said warily. We'll only stay a minute. He pulled her onto the dock, and she relented. The boards of the dock creaked beneath their feet as they walked. The boathouse swayed and bobbed up and down as the waves grew higher. It smelled of fish and mildew and decaying wood. George struggled to pull open the door, which was heavy and warped so that it slid only with great effort, and they stepped inside. He was still holding her hand. Rotting, broken canoes bobbed up and down inside, banging noisily together as the water swirled in, then out. The far end, usually open to the bay, had been boarded up to keep any new boats from getting in. Light streamed in from an enormous jagged hole in the arched roof. Wooden stairs, most of them broken or missing, led to a storage area above their heads. The smell of rotting fish and mildew grew stronger. Let's get out of here. This place is creepy, Renee whispered. What do you want to show me? Over here, he whispered back, pulling her across the warped wooden floorboards. He pulled her to the edge where the floor ended and the water began. Look, here, he pointed down. There, tucked in the back of a bobbing canoe, was a perfectly round nest of twigs and tree bark, filled with baby robins. They had their heads up and their mouths open, squeaking and squealing for their mother, who was probably out finding food for them. How sweet, Renee said. You're right, this did cheer me up. They're so adorable. George grinned and squeezed her hand. He isn't such a bad guy, Renee thought. I've really been unfair to him. Sit down for just a minute, George said, dropping down to the floor, letting his feet dangle over the side. The water was inching higher. It was nearly up to George's running shoes. We really shouldn't stay, Renee said uneasily, but she sat down beside him anyway. It was nice of you to show me the baby robins. I wanted to show you a lot of things, he said wistfully, staring down into the water. I'm sorry things didn't work out, Renee said. Things usually don't work out for me, he said with unusual bitterness. It seems to be the story of my life. Renee realized she didn't know anything about his life. The night they had sneaked out, he said he was poor. That was about all she knew about him. I haven't had a happy life, he continued, as if reading her thoughts. In fact, a lot of bad things have happened to me. Someone I really loved was killed. It changed me. For good. Nothing has been the same since. I'm sorry, she said. She felt foolish. It was such an inadequate reply, but what was she supposed to say? Why was he telling her this? In a few hours she'd be gone, away from camp, away from him. She'd probably never see him again. He pulled his feet up and scooted back. The water had risen almost up to floor level. The tide's coming in fast, he said, watching the bobbing canoes. It's kind of exciting, don't you think? You really feel like you're in a different world. You feel far from everyone, from everything. George, let's go, she pleaded. He looked hurt. Please, Renee. I know you're going home today. Won't you stay with me just a little longer? Look. He pointed to the canoe with the nest. The mother bird had returned, carrying a long, squirming earthworm. The baby robins squealed even louder, grabbing at the worm with their tiny pointed beaks. I really want to get out of here, Renee said, climbing to her feet. Come on, the water's getting higher. She saw a large black rat hop from canoe to canoe. The canoes bobbed more violently, banging together as the water rose. The rat made its way excitedly from boat to boat. Renee saw another rat, even larger, hopping after it. I just want to get out of here, she cried. Okay, George said, unable to hide his unhappiness. I just thought we'd talk for a little while, that's all. You're nervous a lot of the time, aren't you? She didn't reply. How was she supposed to answer a question like that? He really didn't want an answer. He was just being unpleasant. Glancing back at the two scampering rats, she followed close behind George as they made their way to the boathouse door. He turned the metal knob and pushed. Then he pushed again, a little harder. He tried it once again, turning the knob as far as it would move and leaning into the thick wooden door with his shoulder. Then he tried turning the knob in the other direction. Then he tried pulling on the door instead of pushing it. When he turned back to Renee, he had a very worried expression on his face. "The door's locked," he said. "Someone has locked us in." Chapter 17. "George, that's not funny," Renee cried. The water lapped at her sneakers. The tide was coming in faster. The entire boathouse rocked and swayed against the dock as the murky brown waters rose. The expression on George's face told Renee he wasn't joking. His eyes were wild with fright, and his mouth was set in a determined line. He jiggled the doorknob frantically, trying it in one direction, then the other. He lowered his shoulder and shoved against the door with all his might. "No!" he cried out as his feet slipped out from under him and he fell on the wet floorboards. "Getting slippery," he said, climbing back up and resuming his efforts. "The water's up to my ankles," Renee cried. "We've got to get out of here fast. Can't you break the door down?" "No, the wood is too thick," he said. "Maybe I can find a weak spot in the wall, but it's hard to get a grip." The cold water crept up past Renee's ankles. She looked for a higher place to stand, but there was none. "What's that clicking sound?" she asked, trying not to sound as frightened as she felt. She turned around and saw the answer to her own question. The clicking was the sound of rats' feet. At least a dozen large black rats were scampering excitedly from one rotting canoe to another as the waters rose. "George, the rats! Just ignore them. Maybe they'll ignore us. The tide sure comes in fast. He didn't finish what he was saying because the entire boathouse suddenly lurched to the right, throwing them both to the floor. The rats began to squeal and hop faster from boat to boat. Renee jumped up quickly. The brown water was up to her knees. She ran over to George and grabbed his shoulder. "George, if we don't get out, we're going to drown." "Don't worry, we'll get out." His words sounded brave, but his frightened face told a different story. "Hetty!" Renee shouted suddenly. "Hetty, let us out!" There was no reply. "You think Hetty locked us in?" George asked, surprised. The water was above their knees. Renee realized she'd have to scream louder to be heard over the screeching of the rats and the roar of the swirling water. "Hetty!" she shouted, cupping her hands over her mouth. "Let us out! You've got the part! I'm going home! What more do you want?" They listened for a reply, but for any sign that another human was nearby. Silent. "Is anybody out there?" George called, his voice cracking. "Can anybody hear us?" Silence. "Hetty, let us out!" Renee cried. "Hetty, we're going to drown in here!" The commotion excited the rats. The high-pitched squeals became higher-pitched. As the canoes bobbed more violently in the churning water, the rats became more daring, leaping higher, scampering across a boat quickly, then plunging over the side, up into the air, onto the next boat. "Hetty, please!" Renee was begging now. The water was nearly up to her waist. The rotting rafters above them creaked and groaned. The boathouse shifted to the left, then swayed to the right again. "Hetty, I'm in here too!" George shouted. "It's me! George! Hetty, let us out! Let us out!" Again, the only reply was the shrill squeals of the scampering rats. "Why is she doing this?" Renee cried, no longer able to keep the fear out of her voice. "Does she really want to kill us both?" George shrugged. "You tell me." He sounded more angry than frightened. "Try again. The door. Try to push it." Renee's mind was swirling like the water, and her panic was rising just as rapidly. "The water's too high. It's hard to get any balance." George put his shoulder to the door, but his feet went out from under him. He splashed back up. "Hetty! Hetty, let us out!" Renee screamed. George tried pushing again, then slipped again. A rat hopped onto his shoulder. It stood there, balanced on its two hind legs. "No, get it off! Get it off!" Renee shrieked. The rat squealed in George's ear, then dived off into a canoe. George shuddered, slipped again, tried to regain his footing, but fell face forward into the water. The water crept up above Renee's waist. It felt ice cold. The thick mud it carried clung to her legs and her shorts. She bumped up against the door, and to her surprise, the door moved. The door was open. The door wasn't locked. George was still splashing in the water, trying to regain his feet. Renee's heart pounded with happiness, with relief. For a moment, she was too stunned to speak. "George," she said finally. She wanted to tell him the good news, but then something made her stop. A frightening thought made her stop. "George," she called, putting the fear back in her voice. He regained his feet and, wet and mud-soaked, pulled himself forward to rejoin her. "George, try the door again, please." Okay, maybe this time, he said, shaking his water from his hair, then wiping his eyes with his hands. Maybe she'll open this time. He tried the doorknob again, first slowly, then with angry desperation. He put his shoulder against the door and pushed once again. The door didn't budge. He turned to her, his face revealing total panic, total resignation. It's still locked, Renee. What are we going to do? Now she knew. She knew that he was lying. The door wasn't locked. The door was open. They could step out the door, step out of the boathouse, step out of the terrifying nightmare. George was acting. It was all a performance. But why? Was he really trying to kill them both? Or just her?